The first sign that something was wrong wasn't a sound. It was the silence. The veteran noticed it at dawn, when he stepped outside the cabin with a steaming mug of coffee and realized the birds were gone. No distant calls, no flutter of wings among the trees, only the wind moving through the pines as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. His name was Ethan Cole, and he had bought that land for precisely that silence. Thousands of acres of mountain forest, far from paved roads, far from curiosity, far from anything that resembled the life he had left behind. After 2 decades in conflict zones, Ethan didn't seek peace in the usual sense of the word. He sought predictability, clear boundaries, a place where every sound had an explanation. The fence was one of those boundaries. He had installed it himself weeks earlier. Simple, functional, reinforced wire. Nothing sophisticated. Not to keep people out, but to mark territory. To make it clear to anyone who wandered close enough that this land had an owner. That someone was watching. That was why, when Ethan saw the cut, his body reacted before his mind did. The wire had been severed cleanly and precisely, as if done with the right tool at the right angle. There were no signs of haste, no clumsy attempt to force a way through. Just a deliberate cut, low enough to crawl under, high enough to avoid being accidental. Ethan approached slowly. He knelt, touched the metal, its exposed edges already beginning to oxidize. An old habit. Assess before acting. What caught his attention wasn't the cut itself, but what wasn't there. No tire tracks, no signs of a struggle, no obvious footprints on the other side. The ground was unnaturally clean, as if someone had taken care not to leave traces or knew exactly where to step. He lifted his gaze and scanned the tree line ahead. Dense forest, uneven ground, a steep incline. This wasn't a place people crossed by mistake. Anyone who passed through that fence knew exactly where they were going. Ethan drew a slow breath, feeling that familiar weight settle in his chest. Not fear. Recognition. For years, he had learned to distinguish accident from intent, the difference between someone lost and someone on a mission. And everything about that cut, the height, the angle, the absence of signs, pointed to intent. He stood and walked back to the cabin without repairing the fence. Inside, he took his binoculars, the notebook where he logged local wildlife movement patterns, and the radio he rarely used. Then he positioned himself at the highest point of the clearing, where he had a wide view of the valley below. The forest remained quiet, but Ethan knew this well. When nature falls silent like that, it usually means something, or someone, has already passed through, and whatever had crossed that fence had not done so by accident. Ethan waited, not out of hesitation, but discipline. For the rest of the morning, he stayed at the edge of the clearing, binoculars resting lightly against his chest, scanning the tree line in slow, deliberate arcs. He wasn't looking for movement so much as absence, places where animals should have been, paths that should have been disturbed. The forest spoke in patterns, and after months living alone at that altitude, Ethan had learned to read them fluently. The silence persisted longer than it should have. By mid-morning, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine resin down the slope. Still no birds, no small mammals darting through the underbrush. Whatever had crossed his fence hadn't merely passed through, it had displaced everything around it. Ethan finally moved. He approached the breach again, this time circling wide before kneeling beside it. He examined the cut with more care now. The wire hadn't been twisted or torn, it had been snipped. Clean pressure, likely bolt cutters, heavy duty, not something carried casually. He followed the imagined line of passage beyond the fence, choosing his steps carefully, placing his boots where rocks broke the soil instead of soft earth. 10 yards in, he stopped. There it was. A footprint. Partial. Almost missed. Tactical boot. Vibram-style sole, deep lugs designed for mixed terrain. The print angled slightly inward, suggesting someone moving downhill under load. Ethan exhaled slowly. 1 footprint meant nothing. 2 meant coincidence. 3 meant intent. He found 4 more within the next 20 yards, each spaced evenly, each placed with precision. Whoever this was knew how to move without advertising their presence, but no one moved perfectly forever. The trail led toward the eastern ridge, a section of his land he rarely visited. Not because it was inaccessible, but because it was inconvenient. Steeper terrain, narrow valleys, dense growth fed by a year-round stream. The kind of place animals favored, and people avoided. Unless they had a reason. As Ethan followed the trail, memories surfaced uninvited. Patrols at dawn. Unfamiliar ground. The quiet tension of knowing someone else might be watching. He pushed the thoughts aside and focused on what was in front of him. After nearly an hour, he reached the stream. The water was shallow but fast-moving, cutting a narrow channel through dark stone. Animal tracks crisscrossed the muddy banks. Elk, deer, smaller mammals. Normal. Reassuring. Then he saw what didn't belong. On the far side of the stream, branches had been snapped and repositioned, not broken randomly, but arranged. A crude screen, camouflage made from deadfall and mesh so faded it blended naturally into the forest. A blind. Ethan crouched low and studied it from a distance. The structure was new, less than 2 weeks old, built at an angle that gave a clear view of the watering point without exposing the occupant to the open valley behind. He crossed the stream carefully and approached from the side. Inside the blind, the ground was packed down. Foot traffic, frequent use. He spotted 3 spent casings near the rear edge, partially pressed into the soil. He didn't touch them, only noted their placement. Whoever had fired from here had taken their time. Ethan scanned the surrounding trees and felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. This wasn't opportunistic hunting. It was structured, deliberate. Someone had selected this spot for maximum efficiency. He backed away and continued upstream. That was when he noticed the road. At first it looked like nothing, just a subtle flattening of the undergrowth. But once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. A narrow track, barely wide enough for a vehicle, concealed beneath layered brush and fallen logs. From above, it would have been invisible. From the ground, it was obvious to anyone trained to look for it. Ethan followed the track cautiously. After half a mile, the soil changed, softer, darker, and there, pressed deep into the mud, were tire impressions. Industrial tread, the same pattern he had seen near the gate. His jaw tightened. This road hadn't been cut recently. It had been used, repeatedly. The edges were worn smooth, vegetation pressed flat over time. Months, maybe longer. Someone had been operating on his land long before he arrived. He followed the road until it curved sharply and stopped. Ahead, tucked between 2 massive trees, stood a structure that made his stomach drop. A frame. Wooden beams reinforced with steel brackets. Chains hung from the crossbar, their links darkened with age. The ground beneath was stained, old, soaked deep, layered over time. The smell lingered faintly despite the cold air. This wasn't a temporary camp. This was a processing site. Ethan stepped back slowly, heart steady but heavy. Everything about the setup spoke of planning, of resources, of confidence. Whoever had built this hadn't feared discovery. They hadn't expected anyone to challenge them. He returned to the cabin before dusk, moving along a different route than the one he had taken in. Redundancy. Habit. By the time he reached the clearing, the light was already fading behind the ridgeline. Inside, he spread a topographic map across the table and began marking locations. The fence breach, the blind, the hidden road, the processing frame. When he connected the points, a pattern emerged. The sites formed a loose perimeter, positioned to avoid visibility from the cabin, to control movement through the valley, and to funnel activity toward the stream. Someone knew this land, not as an owner, but as an operator. Ethan leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. He had come here to be left alone. Instead, he had stepped into the center of something that didn't want witnesses. And deep down, he knew one thing for certain. Whoever had crossed his fence wasn't done yet. Ethan didn't sleep that night. Not because he was afraid, but because his mind refused to slow down. Every discovery replayed itself in quiet loops. The cut wire, the blind, the hidden road, the processing frame. None of it fit the story he had told himself about this land when he bought it. Remote, forgotten, empty. It wasn't empty. It had been used. Just before dawn, Ethan rose and stepped outside. Frost clung to the grass, crunching softly beneath his boots. The sky was still dark, but the horizon carried a faint gray line where morning would soon break. He scanned the clearing. Nothing had changed. No new tracks, no movement. Yet the forest still felt wrong, as if it were waiting. Inside the cabin, he opened his notebook and began writing, not thoughts but facts. Times, distances, directions. He listed everything he had found, forcing himself to stay objective. Emotion blurred judgment. Patterns required clarity. By sunrise, he had a working theory. The operation wasn't small. The blind was too well placed. The road too carefully concealed. The processing frame too permanent. This wasn't a lone poacher or even a small group. It was organized, funded, and confident enough to operate repeatedly on private land. Which raised a question that unsettled him more than the evidence itself. Why this land? Thousands of acres of public forest surrounded the region, places where illegal hunting already blended into the noise of legitimate activity. Yet whoever ran this operation had chosen a private property, one that had recently changed hands. Ethan pulled a folded document from a drawer, the purchase agreement. He scanned the details again, lingering on the seller's name. The land had been acquired through an estate sale. No negotiations, no counteroffers, just a clean transaction handled by a law firm 200 miles away. Too clean. Mid-morning, he returned to the breach in the fence. This time, he didn't cross it. Instead, he followed the fence line in both directions, moving slowly, inspecting every post, every length of wire. 300 yards north, he found the second cut. Smaller, higher, less obvious. Someone had tested the perimeter. Ethan marked the location mentally and continued. By noon, he had found 4 breaches in total, each one deliberate, each one positioned to provide access to a different section of the land. This wasn't trespassing. It was logistics. He climbed the western ridge in the early afternoon, choosing a route that gave him elevation without exposing his silhouette against the sky. From the top, he had a clear view of the valley, and beyond it, the hidden road threading its way through the trees. He lay prone and glassed the area for nearly an hour. Then he saw them. 2 vehicles, dark, boxy, moving slowly without headlights despite the fading light under the forest canopy. They followed the concealed road with practiced ease, never hesitating at turns, never stopping to check clearances. Ethan tracked them until they disappeared behind the ridge near the processing site. His pulse remained steady. He didn't move. 15 minutes later, figures emerged. 4 of them, all wearing earth-toned clothing, all moving with purpose. They carried long cases and packs that rode high on their backs, weight distributed carefully. Professionals. Through the binoculars, Ethan noticed something else. The way they spaced themselves, the way one paused to scan while the others moved. Not sloppy, not casual. He wrote times and movements in his notebook, his hand steady. The group split into 2 teams and vanished into the trees. Ethan waited until they were gone before retreating. That evening, he reviewed satellite imagery on his laptop. The resolution wasn't perfect, but patterns emerged when he overlaid terrain data with what he had seen on foot. The hidden road wasn't the only access point. There were at least 2 more routes, faint but present, branching toward neighboring properties. Properties he didn't own. He opened the county records database and began searching parcel histories. What he found made him sit back in his chair. 3 adjacent properties had been sold within the last 18 months, all to the same limited liability company. The names varied slightly, but the registered address was identical, a suite in downtown Denver tied to a legal services firm. Shells. Ethan felt that familiar tightening in his chest, not fear but confirmation. He had seen this before. Organizations that hid behind layers, operations designed to absorb scrutiny without exposing the core. Someone had been buying silence. Just after midnight, the radio crackled to life. Ethan froze. He hadn't turned it on. The sound was faint, distorted, but unmistakable. A burst of static followed by a clipped voice, too low to make out words. Then silence again. He moved slowly to the window and peered into the darkness. Nothing. The radio crackled once more, this time longer. A second voice responded. Ethan shut it off. His cabin wasn't wired into any network. The radio wasn't broadcasting, which meant someone nearby was transmitting on a frequency close enough to bleed through. Close. He didn't turn the lights on. Instead, he retrieved his rifle and checked it methodically, more out of ritual than necessity. He positioned himself near the rear window, where the terrain forced any approach into a narrow path. Minutes passed, then an hour. No movement, no sound. By morning, the forest returned to its uneasy stillness. Ethan stood at the window watching the first light touch the treetops. Whoever was operating on his land knew he was there now, not because he had confronted them, but because he had noticed. And people who invested that much effort into secrecy did not tolerate variables. He closed his notebook and slid it into his pack. The situation had shifted. This was no longer about discovery. It was about what they would do next, and whether he would be ready when they did. Ethan spent the day doing nothing that looked like preparation. From the outside, the cabin remained what it had always been, a quiet structure tucked into a clearing, smoke occasionally rising from the chimney, no movement that suggested alarm. He split firewood at mid-morning. He carried water from the pump. He even took a slow walk along the southern tree line, as if his mind had already accepted the fence cuts as an inconvenience rather than a warning. But every motion had a purpose. He was buying time. Back inside, he laid his map out again and added what he'd seen the previous afternoon. 2 vehicles, 4 men, long cases, the split into teams. He marked likely entry points and routes between the breaches. Then he traced the terrain the way he used to trace neighborhoods on satellite imagery overseas, identifying natural funnels, blind rises, narrow passes, and the handful of places where a person had to slow down. The cabin sat in the worst possible place for someone who wanted to disappear. A clearing was comfort. A clearing was light. A clearing was visibility. A clearing was also a target. Ethan moved through his home with quiet efficiency. He didn't set traps like a movie character. He didn't rig the place with surprises. He simply stripped the cabin of weaknesses. He killed the lights and switched to low, controlled illumination that wouldn't spill through the windows. He moved anything reflective away from sightlines. He checked the integrity of each door and window latch, not because he expected them to hold against force, but because he needed to know exactly how much noise they would make if someone tested them. Then he stepped outside and walked the perimeter, counting steps. From the rear window to the stand of pines, 42. From the porch to the nearest dip in the land, 26. From the woodpile to the line where the grass turned to mud, 19. When he finished, he returned inside and waited. Not by the door, not by the front window. He chose a corner with a clear view of the back slope, where any approach would be forced into a narrow corridor between boulders and brush. There, he sat with the rifle across his lap and the radio beside him, turned off, listening to the cabin breathe as the temperature dropped. At dusk, the forest began to speak again. Bird calls returned in hesitant bursts. Something small rustled in the undergrowth. The silence loosened as if whatever had disrupted it earlier had moved farther away. For a moment, Ethan almost believed the intrusion had been a single event. Men passing through, careless or bold, and now gone. Then, shortly after midnight, the radio crackled. 1 second of static. Then 2. Then the clipped murmur of a voice just out of range. Ethan didn't reach for it. He stayed still and listened as if the sound were coming from the wind itself. He knew better than to treat technology like magic. Radios bled, frequencies overlapped. Sometimes you picked up scraps of conversation meant for someone else. Sometimes you were being reminded that you could be reached. The static faded. 5 minutes later, it returned, longer this time, a burst that lasted almost 8 seconds, followed by a second voice responding in a lower register. Ethan's eyes moved to the dark window. Outside, the clearing lay silver under moonlight, the grass pale with frost. Nothing moved. No headlights, no flash of a flashlight, no careless step. The calm felt staged. He waited until the radio fell silent again, then stood and crossed the cabin slowly, placing each step with care. He stopped near the rear window and held his breath. That was when he heard it. Not a footstep. A pause. The faint shift of weight on frozen ground, barely audible, but enough. Ethan had spent too many nights in places where sound carried strangely. He recognized the difference between the forest settling and something human attempting to become part of it. He angled his view and saw a shape at the edge of the pines, a silhouette broken by branches. Not close, maybe 80 yards back, but positioned perfectly where the tree line met the open clearing. Close enough to observe the cabin, far enough to retreat into darkness instantly. Ethan didn't lift the rifle. He didn't move at all. He let the silhouette exist. The figure stayed still for a full minute, then shifted to the left. Slowly, deliberately, as if testing whether the cabin would react. Ethan watched it slide behind a trunk and disappear. A second shape appeared a moment later, farther right. They were counting, measuring, learning. Ethan backed away from the window without making a sound. He moved to the side of the cabin where the wall gave him an angle on the clearing without exposing his own outline. He lowered himself to the floor and watched through a narrow gap where the boards didn't seal perfectly. For another 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then a small object landed softly in the frost near the woodpile. No clang, no thud, just a muted tap, like a stone tossed gently. Ethan's stomach tightened. It wasn't an attack, not yet. It was a message. He watched the object for a long time. Even in low light, he could make out its shape, roughly cylindrical, the size of a soda can. It didn't flash. It didn't spark. It just sat there, dark against the pale ground, as if placed carefully. He waited. Another object landed closer to the porch, this one rolling a few inches before stopping. Ethan didn't need to pick it up to understand what they were doing. They were forcing a choice. Either he would step outside to investigate, giving them a clear silhouette in open ground, or he would stay inside, confirming the cabin was occupied by someone cautious enough to be a problem. He stayed inside. The radio crackled again. This time the voice came through clearer, like the transmitter had moved closer or someone had adjusted power. "He's there," the voice said. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. A second voice answered, calm and impatient. "Then stop playing. Do it." Ethan felt something old settle over him. Not panic. Focus. He shifted his weight and slowly lifted the rifle, bringing it to a ready position without pointing it at anything. He wasn't looking to shoot a person. He was looking to control the night. Outside, a faint light blinked near the tree line. One quick flicker, then darkness again. Someone had used a covered flashlight for a fraction of a second. A signal, then movement. A figure crossed from the trees into the clearing, low and fast, heading toward the porch. Another followed 10 yards behind, mirroring the pace. 2 more shapes remained near the line, holding position. Ethan watched the lead figure approach the porch steps. The person paused, crouched, and reached toward the door as if feeling for a latch or a device. There was an unnatural calm to the gesture, as if the intruder expected the cabin to be empty, or expected the occupant to be too intimidated to resist. Ethan exhaled once, controlled and quiet. Then he fired, not at the intruder, at the porch post. The bullet struck hard and clean, splintering wood inches from the person's hand. The crack echoed through the clearing like a warning shot amplified by the cold air. The intruder froze, then threw himself backward off the porch steps. Ethan fired again, slightly lower, putting a round into the wooden beam that supported the handrail. Another shower of splinters. The message was unmistakable. "I can hit what I want. I am choosing not to hit you." The figures scattered instantly, moving with trained coordination. One dove behind the woodpile. Another rolled into a shallow dip in the ground. The 2 at the tree line shifted positions, as if trying to triangulate where the shots came from. They were good, but they were not home. Ethan changed angles. He didn't stay in one window. He moved through the cabin like he was walking a familiar corridor, stepping into a new position every few seconds, never repeating the same line twice. The goal wasn't to fire constantly, it was to create uncertainty, an invisible shooter who could be anywhere. He watched the woodpile figure lean, trying to spot him. Ethan fired once. The round punched into the ground beside the intruder's boot, throwing up frozen dirt and frost. The person recoiled, then crawled backward, retreating toward the tree line. The radio erupted in static and clipped anger. "What the hell? He's not missing. Pull back, pull back." Ethan fired one more shot, this time into the trunk of a tree near the far right figure. Bark exploded outward and the silhouette vanished instantly into the dark. Within seconds, the clearing was empty again. No footsteps, no shouting, no gunfire in return. Just the wind and the quiet crackle of the cabin settling. Ethan lowered the rifle and listened. The radio crackled once more. Faint, distant now, as if the transmitter was moving away. "He's military," someone said, voice tight. A pause. "Yeah," another replied. "But that doesn't tell us what he knows." Then silence. Ethan didn't move for a full minute. He held still long enough to ensure this wasn't a feint, long enough for the night to resume its natural rhythm. When he finally stood, he crossed to the window and looked at the clearing. The objects near the woodpile and porch remained where they had landed. He waited until dawn before stepping outside. In daylight, the cylinders were obvious. 2 cheap empty drink cans wrapped in dark tape to give them shape. No explosives, no threat, just bait, thrown with care, meant to draw him into the open. Ethan stared at them for a long moment, then looked toward the tree line. The message they'd tried to send was clear. "We can reach your door whenever we want." His answer had been just as clear. "So can I." He went back inside, sat at the table, and opened his notebook. He wrote down everything that mattered: the time the radio came alive, the number of intruders, their spacing, how they moved, how quickly they retreated once they realized he wasn't prey. Then he wrote the line that had been forming in his mind since the fence cut. They weren't testing the cabin. They were testing him. And now they knew 2 things. First, he was not leaving. Second, They would need a different plan. Ethan closed the notebook and slid it aside. His next moves would determine whether this ended quietly, or whether the people behind the operation decided that subtlety was no longer worth the effort. Outside, the forest finally returned to normal sound. Birds, small creatures, the soft chatter of life. But Ethan no longer trusted it. Because silence had been the first signal. And last night the silence had moved right up to his front door. Ethan didn't chase them. That was the part they hadn't expected. He spent the morning after the intrusion doing the opposite of what fear would suggest. He repaired the porch post with a temporary brace. He walked the clearing openly in daylight. He even left the cabin door ajar while he brewed coffee, letting the thin column of smoke rise steadily from the chimney. From a distance it looked like resignation. In reality it was documentation. He photographed the splintered wood, the impact points, the taped cans left behind as bait. He measured distances from the tree line to the porch, from the woodpile to the shallow dip where one of them had taken cover. He marked everything on his map with clean, unemotional precision. By noon, he had what he needed. The men who had come to his cabin weren't amateurs, but they weren't soldiers either. Their spacing had been disciplined, their retreat fast, but their mistakes were telling. They had underestimated the terrain. They had assumed intimidation would work. Most importantly, they had shown up personally. Operations like this only did that when something valuable was at risk. Ethan spent the afternoon on his laptop digging deeper than before. He cross-referenced the LLCs tied to the surrounding properties, looking past surface registrations and into transaction histories, shell accounts, and land use permits. It took hours, but the pattern emerged clearly once he stopped looking for names and started looking for timing. Property purchases clustered around specific months. Vehicle registrations followed shortly after. Construction permits, filed, then quietly withdrawn. Someone had been building an infrastructure without ever intending to finish it. That evening, Ethan made his first call. He didn't start with local law enforcement. Small jurisdictions struggled with large, well-funded operations, and he had no interest in alerting the wrong people. Instead, he contacted the regional office of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, requesting to speak directly with an enforcement agent. When the call was returned an hour later, Ethan spoke calmly. He described what he had found. He described what he had seen. He described the confrontation at his cabin, carefully, factually, without embellishment. The agent listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, there was a pause on the line. "Can you send us everything you've documented?" the agent asked. "Yes," Ethan replied. "And I believe this operation is connected to interstate wildlife trafficking, possibly international." Another pause. "We'll be there in the morning." The night passed quietly. No radios, no movement, no tests. At dawn, 2 unmarked vehicles rolled into the clearing, their tires crunching softly over frost. A woman stepped out first, followed by a man carrying a hard case. Both wore plain jackets and expressions that suggested long familiarity with remote places and worse discoveries. They spent the day walking the land with Ethan. They examined the blind, the hidden road, the processing frame. They photographed everything again with their own equipment, nodding grimly as each piece confirmed what Ethan had suspected. "This is not small," the woman said finally. "This is a hub." By late afternoon, they were joined by others, agents from different departments arriving quietly, efficiently, no sirens, no spectacle, just people who knew how to move without drawing attention. Over the next 3 days, Ethan watched his land transform into the center of something far larger than himself. Surveillance teams mapped the hidden routes. Analysts traced the shell companies back through layers of legal insulation. When the vehicles returned, this time before dawn on the 4th day, they didn't find an isolated veteran waiting inside a cabin. They found a perimeter. The SUVs rolled in exactly as before, confident and dark, engines humming low. Men disembarked with rifles and gear, moving toward the processing site with practiced ease. They didn't realize they were surrounded until it was too late. Commands rang out from the trees. Lights snapped on. Voices barked orders with authority that didn't ask permission. The men froze, confusion flashing across their faces as they were forced to the ground. Within minutes, they were zip-tied, disarmed, and escorted away under the watchful eyes of federal agents who had been waiting patiently for this moment. Simultaneous raids unfolded elsewhere. In Denver, offices tied to the shell companies were searched and seized. In another state, a storage facility holding preserved animal parts was shut down. Bank accounts were frozen. Client lists recovered. By noon, The operation was finished. Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing watching as evidence was catalogued and vehicles were loaded. The woman who had first arrived approached him, her expression tired but satisfied. "You disrupted something that's been running for years," she said. "They chose your land because they thought it was empty." Ethan nodded. "It was." She gave a small, knowing smile. "Not anymore." 6 months later, the forest sounded different. Not louder. Healthier. The hidden roads were gone, reclaimed by soil and new growth. The processing frame had been dismantled and removed. Motion cameras now dotted the land again, but these belonged to conservation teams monitoring recovering wildlife populations. The men who had crossed Ethan's fence were facing charges that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The financiers behind the operation were no longer protected by distance or paperwork. Ethan's cabin remained unchanged. Same porch, same clearing, same fence, this time reinforced and visible, not as a threat, but as a statement. People occasionally asked him why he hadn't simply sold the land and left after everything that happened. Ethan never gave a long answer. He had spent years walking away from places once the mission ended. This time, the land itself had become the mission. At dusk, he often sat on the porch and watched the tree line, rifle resting nearby, not because he expected trouble, but because awareness had become part of who he was. The forest no longer fell silent when he stepped outside, and no one crossed his fence again, not because of fear, but because some boundaries, once tested, make it very clear what happens next.